January 27th, 1974. San Francisco. The city is still vibrating from the echoes of the Zodiac Killer. But a new, quieter predator is beginning to move through the fog of Ocean Beach. At 1:57 a.m., a passerby spots a shape at the water's edge. It is 49-year-old Gerald Kavanaugh. He has been stabbed multiple times, his body left in a supine position, face up to the cold Pacific stars. Kavanaugh was a Canadian immigrant, a factory worker, and a quiet man. He was the first. But at the time, police saw no patterns, just another tragedy in a city that was seeing too many. What they didn't know was that the man who killed Gerald didn't just carry a knife, he carried a sketch pad, and he was just getting started. By the summer of 1974, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The killer had a specific ritual. He would frequent the gay bars and nightclubs of the Castro and Tenderloin districts, places like the Truck Stop or Bojangles. He was described as a young, handsome black man, around 6 feet tall, with a slender build. He wouldn't lead with violence, he led with talent. He would sit at the bar, catch the eye of a victim, and begin to draw. He would show them a caricature or a cartoon he'd just made of them. It was a perfect icebreaker, flattering, intimate, and artistic. He told his targets he was an art student. Once he had gained their trust, he would suggest leaving for a more private location, usually the dark stretches of Golden Gate Park or the dunes of Ocean Beach. Once there, the artist vanished and the monster took over. The sketches were never found at the crime scenes. He took them with him. His victims weren't just targets, they were his audience, and he was the only one who got to see the final frame. June 25th, 1974. Joseph J. Stevens is found near Spreckles Lake. He was a popular female impersonator and comedian, a man full of life, silenced in the bushes of Golden Gate Park. Just 12 days later, the beach claims another. Klaus Christmann, a German national, is found at the foot of Lincoln Way. His attack was the most violent yet, 15 stab wounds and a slashed throat. The city's LGBTQ+ community began to realize they were being hunted. But in 1974, reporting these crimes came with a different kind of danger. To talk to the police often meant outing yourself at a time when that could mean losing your job, your family, or your safety. This silence was the Doodler's greatest weapon. By 1975, the bodies continued to mount. Frederick Capon, a Vietnam veteran and nurse, was found in May. Then Harold Gullberg in June. The tally was officially 5, but investigators whispered that the real number could be as high as 16. The Doodler was outpacing the Zodiac, yet the headlines were strangely quiet. In late 1975, the police finally got their break. 3 men survived. One was a well-known entertainer, another a diplomat. They had met a man who began to sketch them, but they had managed to escape before the knife could finish the job. They provided the descriptions that led to the famous police sketch we see today. Police actually zeroed in on a suspect. They questioned a young man who carried a sketch pad and frequented the same bars. He didn't deny being there, but he never confessed. The detectives were confident they had their man. There was just one problem. The survivors refused to testify. In a heartbreaking twist of the era, the diplomat and the entertainer feared the public exposure more than they wanted justice. They refused to appear in court, knowing their careers would be over the moment they took the stand. Without their testimony, the DA couldn't file charges. The suspect walked out of the station, disappeared into the San Francisco fog, and the murders simply stopped.
The Doodler was never caught. For decades, the files sat in a basement. But in recent years, the SFPD has reopened the case. They have released age-progressed sketches of what the killer might look like today, a man in his early 70s. They are using forensic genealogy, the same tech that caught the Golden State Killer, to look for a match in the DNA left on those vintage crime scenes. The Doodler used art to lure men to their deaths, and he used the prejudices of the 1970s to hide from the law. He remains one of the most prolific, unidentified serial killers in American history. A man who drew your face before he took your life.
Why did he stop? This is the question that haunts the SFPD Cold Case Unit. Most serial killers don't simply quit. They're interrupted by death, prison, or physical inability. If the suspect questioned in 1975 was indeed the Doodler, he would be in his early 70s today. FBI profilers suggest he was a man driven by deep-seated self-loathing. By targeting men in the very spaces he himself frequented, he was acting out a cycle of shame and violence. His doodles weren't just a ruse, they were a way to exert power. He captured his victims' likenesses on paper before destroying their lives in reality. To this day, psychologists study the Doodler as a rare example of a killer who used creative bait, a hunter who didn't use a gun or a trap, but a pencil and a smile.
For 40 years, the Doodler was a forgotten shadow. But in 2018, everything changed. Inspired by the capture of the Golden State Killer, San Francisco police increased the reward for information to $100,000. They released a new age-progressed sketch of a man with thinning hair and a weathered face. A man who might be your neighbor, your grandfather, or the quiet man at the end of the bar. Even more significant, they found DNA. In a lab in California, technicians are currently working on a degraded sample found at one of the 1974 crime scenes. They are using genetic genealogy to build a family tree of the killer. We are closer now than we have ever been. The silence that protected the Doodler for 5 decades is finally being broken by the loud, undeniable voice of modern science.
The Doodler's story is a tragedy of 2 parts. The lives taken by a monster, and the justice denied by the era they lived in. Gerald Kavanaugh, Joseph Stevens, Klaus Christmann, Frederick Capon, and Harold Goldberg. These weren't just names in a police file. They were pioneers, veterans, and friends who were forced to live and die in the shadows. As we look at the sketch of the artist of death, we are reminded that the past is never truly buried. Somewhere, perhaps still in the Bay Area, an old man holds a secret he has kept for 50 years. But the clock is ticking, because while the Doodler may have stopped drawing, the world has not stopped looking for him.
Anchorage, Alaska, February 1, 2012. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig is finishing her shift at a roadside coffee hut. On the security footage, a man approaches. He looks like any other customer until he jumps through the window with a gun. He turns off the lights. Samantha disappears into the Alaskan night. For weeks, the city is on edge. Then a ransom note appears with a photo of Samantha holding a recent newspaper. Her family pays the $30,000, desperate for her return. They didn't know they were dealing with a man who'd been practicing the art of the perfect murder for over a decade. A man who didn't just kill, he prepared for it years in advance.
To his neighbors, he was a dedicated father and a hard-working construction contractor, but had a secret that sounds like a horror movie plot. He didn't kill in his own backyard. Instead, he would fly across the country, rent a car, and drive for hundreds of miles. He never used credit cards. He never stayed in one place. But his most chilling signature? The kill kits. Years before he intended to strike, he traveled to remote areas in Vermont, New York, or Washington. He would bury plastic buckets filled with weapons, silencers, zip ties, and chemicals to dissolve bodies. He would mark the GPS coordinates and go back to his normal life. These kits sat underground for years, hidden time bombs waiting for their creator to return. Most serial killers have a type. Keyes didn't. He didn't care about age, gender, or race. In 2011, he flew to Chicago, drove to Vermont, and dug up a kit he'd buried 2 years prior. Chose a house at random, the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier. He broke in, bound them, and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he had scouted earlier. There was no connection between them, no motive, just a cold, calculated desire to exercise total control. After the act, he simply flew back to Alaska and took his daughter to the movies. He was a ghost because he had no pattern. No pattern means no trail.
The ransom money from the Samantha Koenig case was his undoing. He used the stolen debit card at ATMs across the southern U.S., allowing the FBI to track his movement. When they finally pulled him over in Texas, they found Samantha's phone and the tools of his trade. In the interrogation room, he was arrogant, admitted to at least 11 murders, but hinted at many more. He told the FBI, "There is no one who knows me or who has ever known me who knows anything about me, really." But the world would never get the full truth. In December 2012, while awaiting trial, he died in his cell, leaving behind a note and drawings of 11 skulls. He took his secrets and the locations of his remaining kill kits to the grave.
Boston, April 2009. Inside the elegant Marriott Long Wharf Hotel, the silence of the hallway is broken by a muffled struggle. 25-year-old Julissa Brisman, an aspiring actress, is found at the entrance of her room. She had been bound and shot. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle in the lobby. The only clue left behind was a digital footprint. Julissa had placed an ad on Craigslist offering massage services. She thought she was meeting a client in a safe, upscale hotel. She didn't realize she had invited a predator into the room, one who used the internet as his private hunting ground. Days before the murder of Julissa, another woman was robbed at gunpoint at the Westin Copley Place Hotel. She, too, had advertised on Craigslist. The police realized they weren't looking for a career criminal or a drifter. They were looking for someone who knew how to navigate the city's high-end hotels without drawing a single glance. Security footage from the hotels showed the same man, tall, blonde, clean-cut, wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap. He looked like a typical college student because that's exactly what he was. While the Boston PD scrambled to find him, he was already back in his apartment, living a life that was the definition of perfect. The digital trail led investigators to a quiet apartment in Quincy, Massachusetts. When they checked the name on the lease, they were stunned. Philip Markoff was a 23-year-old second-year medical student at Boston University. He was engaged to be married to a beautiful woman who believed he was her man of gold. To his classmates, he was a genius. To his fiancée, he was a protector. But inside his apartment, police found the trophies of his secret life. Hidden inside a hollowed-out medical textbook, they found the gun used in the murder and the plastic zip ties used to bind his victims. He wasn't killing for money. He was a high achiever who sought a dark thrill that his medical career couldn't provide.
The arrest of Philip Markoff sent shockwaves through the country. How could a future doctor, someone sworn to save lives, be so cold-blooded? His fiancée stood by him at first, unable to believe the man she loved was a killer. But as the evidence mounted, she eventually left him. Markoff never made it to trial. In August 2010, on what would have been his first wedding anniversary, he was found dead in his jail cell. He had used his medical knowledge to end his own life, using a sharpened piece of metal and plastic. He left no note, no explanation. He took his motives to the grave, leaving behind a legacy as the man who turned the internet's most popular classified site into a map of terror.
August 1990, Gainesville, Florida. It was supposed to be the most exciting week of the year, the start of a new semester at the University of Florida. Thousands of students were moving into apartments full of hope for the future, but a shadow had followed them to campus. Danny Rolling didn't belong in Gainesville. He was a drifter from Louisiana, a man with a violent past and a head full of dark fantasies. He set up a campsite in the woods just behind the university housing. From the darkness of the trees, he watched. He wasn't looking for money or fame. He was looking for a stage. He wanted the world to know his name, and he chose the quietest targets to make his point. The violence began on a Friday. Two roommates, Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, were found in their apartment. The scene was unlike anything the local police had ever witnessed. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a performance. Rolling had posed the victims in a way that was designed to shock whoever found them. Panic hit the city like a tidal wave. Students began sleeping in groups, arming themselves with baseball bats and knives. The police department called in every available officer, but the Ripper was already moving. Within 48 hours, 3 more students were gone. The killer moved through the city like a ghost, breaking into second-story windows and vanishing before the sun came up. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses. The only thing he left behind was a signature of absolute brutality.
While the largest manhunt in Florida history focused on the university, Danny Rolling was already back in his campsite, singing songs into a tape recorder. He spoke about his demons and his desire to be a superstar. But his ego became his undoing. Short on cash, Rolling robbed a local grocery store. He wasn't caught at the scene, but in his haste, he abandoned his campsite. When investigators stumbled upon the hidden tent in the woods, they found a treasure trove of evidence. A signature hunting knife, a screwdriver used to pop locks, and those haunting tape recordings. The voice on the tapes gave them a name, but the man belonging to that name was already in custody. He had been arrested for a simple burglary in a nearby county, sitting in a jail cell while the world searched for a monster.
They didn't have to find him. They just had to identify him. In the interrogation room, the tough guy persona Rowling had built for his tapes began to crumble. When confronted with the evidence, he didn't just confess to the 5 murders in Gainesville. He admitted to a triple homicide in his hometown of Shreveport, Louisiana, years earlier. Danny Rowling was a man who wanted to be a legend, but he ended up as a cautionary tale. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006. He died as he lived, craving the spotlight, even singing a gospel song as his final words. Today, the town of Gainesville is peaceful again, but the Ripper remains a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one standing just outside the light of the campfire. On the surface, Michael Swango was the ultimate success story. He was handsome, charismatic, and a brilliant student at Southern Illinois University. He graduated with honors and secured a prestigious internship at Ohio State University. His colleagues saw a dedicated young doctor. His patients saw a man they could trust with their lives. But beneath the white coat was a man obsessed with the process of dying. Even as a child, Swango kept scrapbooks filled with images of horrific accidents and violent crimes. He didn't become a doctor to heal. He became a doctor to gain unfettered access to the vulnerable. He was a predator who realized that in a hospital, death is expected, and a quiet killer can hide in plain sight. The red flags appeared almost immediately. In Ohio, healthy patients began to die shortly after Swango visited their rooms. Nurses noticed a strange pattern. Whenever Dr. Swango offered to get someone a cup of tea or a snack, that person would fall violently ill within minutes. He was caught, not for murder, but for poisoning his own co-workers. Swango had been lacing the staff's coffee and donuts with arsenic and ant killer just to watch them suffer. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but due to a flaw in the system, he was released early. He didn't stop. He changed his name, forged his medical records, and moved to South Dakota. He had realized that the medical community was so desperate for doctors that they often failed to look into a man's past if he had the right credentials.
As the FBI began to close in on his past, Swango fled again. This time, he didn't just move states, he moved across the world to Zimbabwe, Africa. Using his forged documents, he once again gained employment at a remote hospital. The pattern repeated. Patients who were recovering suddenly went into respiratory failure after a checkup from Dr. Swango. The local staff grew suspicious when they found jars of toxic chemicals hidden in his home. Realizing the authorities were coming for him, Swango vanished into the night. He spent months as a global fugitive, traveling through Europe and the Middle East, always looking for a new hospital that would take him in. He was a man who couldn't stop the itch to play God over life and death.
In June 1997, the chase finally ended. Swango attempted to fly back through Chicago's O'Hare International Airport on his way to a new job in Saudi Arabia. Federal agents were waiting at the gate. While investigators believe he may have been responsible for up to 60 deaths across his career, the legal system focused on the cases they could prove with absolute certainty. Michael Swango eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, he sits in a high-security cell in Colorado. He is a chilling reminder that sometimes the person wearing the stethoscope is the most dangerous person in the room.
The summer of 1985 was the hottest in Los Angeles history, but it wasn't the heat that kept people awake at night. It was the sound of a window opening. A shadow was moving through the suburbs, a predator who didn't follow any rules. He didn't have a type. He targeted men, women, and children alike. He became known as the Night Stalker. He was a ghost who could enter a locked home without leaving a trace. People began to buy out every deadbolt and window alarm in the city. The LAPD was facing a monster who left satanic symbols on the walls and vanished before the sun rose. Los Angeles was a city under siege, and the killer was just getting started.
His name was Richard Ramirez, a drifter from El Paso with a mouth full of rotting teeth and a mind obsessed with the occult. Unlike the meticulous Dr. Death or the calculated Israel Keys, Ramirez was chaotic. He would strike multiple homes in a single night. He drove around the sleeping neighborhoods in stolen cars, blasting heavy metal music, looking for an unlocked door. He was a master of the blitz attack, overpowering his victims before they could even scream. But his chaos was his weakness. He left behind physical evidence that a more careful killer would have hidden. A footprint from a rare brand of Avia sneakers, a single fingerprint on a stolen car. These were the digital and physical breadcrumbs that would eventually lead the hunters to his door. The turning point came in August. Ramirez committed a brutal attack in San Francisco, but he left behind a witness who got a look at his face. For the first time, the police had a name and a description. They released his mugshot to every newspaper and television station in California. On August 31, 1985, Richard Ramirez stepped off a bus in East Los Angeles. He didn't know his face was on the front page of every newspaper in the terminal. He walked into a convenience store, saw his own face staring back at him from a stack of papers, and realized the game was over. He tried to flee, running through the streets of East LA, but he didn't run into the police. He ran into the people he had spent months terrifying. In one of the most famous captures in criminal history, it wasn't the authorities who caught the Night Stalker. It was a mob of angry citizens. Residents recognized him, chased him down, and cornered him. By the time the police arrived, they had to save Ramirez from the very community he had victimized. In court, Ramirez showed no remorse, famously flashing a pentagram drawn on his palm and shouting, "Hail Satan!" He was sentenced to death, but died of natural causes in 2013 while still on death row. He was a man who wanted to be a demon, but in the end, he was just another name in the annals of evil, captured by the very neighbors who refused to be victims any longer. In the early 1970s, the coastal town of Santa Cruz, California, was a haven for students and hitchhikers. It was a place where people felt safe. That was the first mistake. Standing 6'9" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Edmund Kemper was a man you couldn't miss. But despite his intimidating size, he was soft-spoken, polite, and possessed an IQ of 145. He was a regular at the Jury Room, a local bar where off-duty police officers gathered to grab a drink. They called him Big Ed. They liked him. They thought he was a gentle giant who just wanted to hear stories about police work. They didn't realize that while they were sharing stories of unsolved crimes, the man buying them rounds was the very person they were looking for. Kemper's method was chillingly simple. He would drive his car around the outskirts of the university campus, looking for young women hitchhiking. Because of his clean-cut appearance and his friendly demeanor, victims felt safe getting into his car.
He was the opposite of what people thought a monster looked like. Once the car door closed, the trap was set. Between 1972 and 1973, Kemper claimed the lives of 6 young women. He didn't just kill them, he took them back to his home, the home he shared with his mother. This was the dark engine behind his rage. Kemper had a deeply disturbed and abusive relationship with his mother, Clarnell. Every life he took was, in his twisted mind, a rehearsal for the one person he truly wanted to destroy. The spree reached its gruesome climax on Easter weekend in 1973. The years of psychological warfare with his mother finally boiled over. After a final argument, Kemper murdered his mother in her sleep. He then invited her best friend over for dinner, murdered her as well, and placed their bodies in the house he had lived in his entire life. He didn't run. He didn't hide. Instead, he got into his car and drove toward the mountains. He waited for the news to break, for the sirens to start, but the world remained silent. Nobody suspected Big Ed. Nobody was coming to arrest the man who bought the cops beers. For the first time in his life, Edmund Kemper realized that he was too good at being a ghost. He was tired of the killing, and he was tired of the silence.
On April 24, 1973, Kemper walked to a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. He dialed the Santa Cruz Police Department. When the dispatcher answered, he told them he was the one they were looking for. At first, the police didn't believe him. They thought it was a prank from a man who had too much to drink. But Kemper insisted. He stayed on the line, giving them details of the crime scenes that only the killer could know. He waited by the phone booth until the police arrived to take him into custody. Today, Edmund Kemper remains one of the few serial killers to have successfully profiled himself. He is serving 8 life sentences in California, a massive, brilliant, and terrifying reminder that the most dangerous person is often the one who knows exactly how the law works.
Houston, Texas, the early 1970s. In the Heights neighborhood, everyone knew Dean Corll. He was the man who owned the local candy company. He was known for his generosity, often handing out free boxes of pralines and chocolates to the local children. He was polite, neatly dressed, and always willing to help a neighbor. But Dean Corll had a secret that would eventually shatter the innocence of the entire city. He wasn't just a candy maker, he was a master manipulator. He realized that to hunt effectively, he didn't need to hide in the shadows. He needed to be the most trusted man on the block. He used his nice guy persona as a cloak, hiding a darkness that the local police couldn't even imagine. Corll's strategy was unique and terrifying. He didn't work alone. He recruited 2 local teenagers, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to act as his scouts. He bribed them with money, cars, and the promise of a cool lifestyle. Their job was to lure their own friends and classmates to Corll's home for parties. Because the boys were inviting people they knew, the victims walked right through the front door without a second thought. Between 1970 and 1973, dozens of young men vanished from the streets of Houston. Families pleaded with the police, but in the 70s, many of these disappearances were dismissed as runaways. The police didn't realize that while they were ignoring the missing person reports, the Candyman was turning a quiet boat storage shed into a graveyard. The horror finally came to an end on August 8, 1973, in a way no one expected. Corll had brought Elmer Wayne Henley and 2 other teenagers to his home, but the dynamic had changed. Henley, who had been Corll's accomplice for years, suddenly realized that he was no longer the partner. He was the next target. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Henley managed to get hold of Coral's own .22 caliber pistol. As Coral lunged at him, Henley fired. The Candyman fell dead on his own floor. When the police arrived, they expected a simple case of self-defense between two acquaintances. Then Henley began to talk. He led the officers to a rented boat shed, and what they found inside changed the city of Houston forever. Under the dirt floor of that shed, police discovered the remains of 28 young men. It was, at the time, the most prolific serial murder case in American history. The city was in shock. The man who had given their children candy was the monster who had taken them away. Coral never stood trial, but his accomplices were sentenced to hundreds of years in prison. This story remains a haunting lesson in the danger of the familiar. It proves that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the stranger in the bushes. It's the person in the bright house at the end of the street, offering you something sweet with a smile that hides a soul of pure ice. July 1982, Washington State. The Green River, usually a place of quiet beauty, becomes a scene of nightmare. Two boys cycling across a bridge look down and see a shape snagged on a log in the water. It's the first of many. Over the next few months, bodies are found in clusters, along riverbanks, in forest clearings, and near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. The Pacific Northwest was gripped by a fear that wouldn't let go for 20 years. The killer was dubbed the Green River Killer. He was a ghost who seemed to know exactly where the police would look and exactly how to stay one step ahead of them. The task force grew to be one of the largest in history, yet they were hunting a man who left almost nothing behind. While the police searched for a mastermind, Gary Ridgway was living a life of absolute mundanity. He worked at a truck painting factory for 30 years. He was married. He attended church. He was the neighbor who mowed his lawn every Saturday and never caused trouble. This was his greatest camouflage. He was profoundly average. Ridgway targeted women on the fringes of society, runaways and sex workers. He knew that in the early 80s, the disappearance of these women was often overlooked by the system. He used this to his advantage, picking up victims in his truck, often with his own son's car seat in the back, to appear safe and family-oriented. He wasn't a genius like Edmund Kemper. He was simply a man with a routine, and his routine was murder. The most frustrating part of the Green River case: the police actually interviewed Gary Ridgway in 1983. They even took a sample of his hair and saliva. But in the 1980s, the technology didn't exist to link him to the crimes. He passed a polygraph test and went right back to work. For the next 2 decades, Ridgway continued his life as a truck painter while the families of the missing waited for answers that never came. The case went cold, but the evidence stayed in a temperature-controlled room, waiting for science to catch up. By 2001, DNA technology had advanced to a point that investigators could finally re-examine the samples they took from Ridgway nearly 20 years prior. The results were a perfect match. The invisible man finally had a face. When Gary Ridgway was arrested, the world was shocked by the scale of his crimes. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to lead police to the locations of his victims. He confessed to 48 murders, though he later hinted the number was closer to 70 or 80. He spoke with his victims with a chilling lack of emotion, describing them as trash he had simply disposed of. Ridgway is currently serving 49 consecutive life sentences in Washington. He is a reminder that serial killers aren't always brilliant or theatrical. Sometimes they are just the quiet man at the factory who works a 9-to-5, goes to church, and hides a graveyard in the woods behind the highway. Wichita, Kansas, January 1974. A family of 4 is found dead in their quiet suburban home. There was no motive, no robbery, and no suspects. The city was paralyzed with fear, but the killer didn't want to stay in the shadows. He wanted to be famous. He wrote a letter to the local newspaper demanding a name for himself. He suggested the B.T.K. Strangler, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a narcissist who craved the spotlight. He would call the police from payphones to report his own crimes and leave poems in library books. He wanted Wichita to know that he was the one in control, a monster who could strike any house at any time. While the police hunted for a madman, Dennis Rader was living the definition of a respectable life. He was a husband, a father of 2, and a leader in his local church. Even more chillingly, he worked as a compliance officer for the city and a security system installer. He was the man people paid to keep them safe from the very person he actually was. Rader was obsessed with rules and order. In his professional life, he would hand out tickets for overgrown lawns or unleashed dogs. In his secret life, he was a cold-blooded stalker who kept detailed hit kits in his van. He used his official-looking uniform to put victims at ease, acting as a protector while he scouted their homes. He lived this double life for nearly 30 years, and for a long time, it seemed like he would get away with it forever. In the late 80s, B.T.K. suddenly went silent. The murders stopped. To the police, it was a cold case. To the public, he was a ghost of the past. Rader had settled into a quiet middle age, focusing on his church and his family. But his ego wouldn't let him stay forgotten. In 2004, a local newspaper ran a story on the 30th anniversary of the first B.T.K. murders. Rader, unable to stand the idea that people might think he was dead or caught, began sending letters again. He was like an aging actor who wanted one last curtain call. He started a game of cat and mouse with the police, asking them if they could trace a floppy disk if he sent one. The police lied. They told him through a newspaper ad, "You can't be traced through a disk, it's safe." Rader believed them. He sent a purple floppy disk to a local TV station, thinking his secret was secure. But within hours, forensic experts found a deleted file on the disk. The metadata showed the name Dennis and a link to a Christ Lutheran church. A quick Google search led police straight to the church's president, Dennis Rader. When they arrested him in February 2005, he was shocked. He actually asked the police, "Why did you lie to me?" He couldn't believe his own ego had been his undoing. Today, Dennis Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences. He is a reminder that while a killer may be able to hide from the law for decades, they can never truly hide from their own desperate need for attention. Chicago, late 1970s. If you lived in the Norwood Park neighborhood, you knew John Wayne Gacy. He was a successful construction contractor, a local precinct captain for the Democratic Party, and a man who hosted legendary neighborhood block parties. But his most famous role was Pogo the Clown. Gacy would dress up in full makeup and costume to perform at children's hospitals and charity events. He was a pillar of the community, a man who seems to have a heart of gold. No one suspected that the man who brought joy to children was spending his nights hunting the young men of Chicago. He used his status and his friendly neighbor persona to create a mask that was nearly impossible to see through. 2:30 to 5 minutes, the trap and the handcuff trick. Gacy's method was as calculated as it was cruel. He often found his victims at bus stations or by offering them high-paying construction jobs at his company. Once he got a young man back to his house, he would show off his magic tricks. His favorite was the handcuff trick. He would show the victim a pair of handcuffs and challenge them to try them on, claiming he could show them how to escape. But once the clicks echoed through the room and the metal was tight, the game changed. The friendly neighbor disappeared, and a monster took his place. Between 1972 and 1978, at least 33 young men fell for this trap. They went into the house on Summerdale Avenue thinking they had found a job opportunity. They never walked out. The beginning of the end came in December 1978. 15-year-old Robert Peast was working at a local pharmacy when he told his mother he was going to talk to a contractor for a summer job. He never returned. Because Robert came from a stable, middle-class family, the police didn't dismiss him as a runaway. They went straight to the contractor, John Wayne Gacy. When detectives entered Gacy's home, they noticed a smell, a thick, sweet, decaying odor that Gacy claimed was a sewage problem. But the detectives weren't convinced. They noticed that the floor in the crawl space beneath the house seemed disturbed. While Gacy was at the police station being questioned, a team of investigators began to dig. What they found wasn't a sewage issue, it was a mass grave. Because Gacy was too lazy to dispose of the bodies elsewhere, he had buried 26 of his victims in the dirt beneath his own living room. As the bodies were pulled one by one from beneath the house, the scale of Gacy's evil became clear. He had literally been sleeping, eating, and hosting parties on top of a graveyard. In court, Gacy tried to plead insanity, claiming he had multiple personalities. But the meticulous way he hid the bodies proved he knew exactly what he was doing. Gacy was sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row before his execution in 1994. Even at the end, he showed no remorse, famously spending his time painting haunting portraits of clowns. He is a terrifying reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear face paint, they throw the best parties, and they are the most respected people in your neighborhood. The heart of Moscow lies Bitsevsky Park, a massive forest where families go to escape the city noise. But between 2001 and 2006, the park became a place of silence and shadows. People were vanishing. Not just tourists or strangers, but elderly men who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. The killer wasn't a ghost. He was a grocery store clerk named Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander was a man obsessed with a single goal. He kept a chessboard under his bed, and for every life he took, he would mark a square with a date and a number. His goal was to fill all 64 squares. To him, the park wasn't a forest, it was his board, and the people walking through it were merely pawns in a game only he was playing. Pichushkin's method was a masterpiece of manipulation. He didn't use a mask or a weapon to lure his victims. Instead, he used a bottle of vodka and a story about a dead dog. He would approach older men in the park, many of whom were lonely or struggling, and ask them to join him in the woods to drink a toast to his beloved pet who had allegedly passed away. Because he worked at the local store, many victims recognized him. They followed him deep into the trees, away from the main paths. Once they were isolated and intoxicated, Pichushkin would strike. He was a man of immense physical strength, often finishing his attacks with a heavy, blunt object. He believed that by taking these lives, he was saving them from a boring existence, but in reality, he was just feeding a dark tally that was growing closer to his goal of 64. For years, the Moscow police struggled to lint the disappearances. Because the victims were often marginalized or elderly, the cases didn't receive the immediate attention they deserved. This gave Pichushkin a sense of invincibility. He began to get bolder, moving from the elderly to younger men and even women he knew personally. He began to view himself as a god of the park. He would watch the police patrols from the bushes, laughing at their inability to find him. But his arrogance became his undoing. He invited a female co-worker, Marina Muskaleva, for a walk in the woods. Marina was suspicious of Alexander, but she agreed to go. However, she did something the other victims hadn't. She left a note for her son. She wrote down Alexander's name and exactly where they were going. When Marina didn't return, her son gave the note to the police. Pichushkil was arrested almost immediately. When investigators searched his apartment, they didn't just find a killer, they found a historian of horror. Under his bed was the chessboard. 61 squares were filled with dates. He had nearly reached his goal of 64. During his trial, Petrushkin was defiant. He didn't ask for mercy. He complained that the police hadn't given him credit for enough murders. He claimed he had killed far more than 60 he was officially charged with. He was sentenced to life in a special regime colony, Russia's harshest prison. He remains there today, a man who tried to turn human lives into a game, only to find himself trapped in a square he can never leave.
Deep within the Belonglo State Forest in New South Wales, Australia, the trees grow thick and the silence is heavy. In 1992, two runners stumbled upon a site that would change the country forever, a shallow grave containing the remains of two British backpackers. The discovery sparked a wave of panic that traveled across the globe. Australia had always been seen as a paradise for young travelers, but now parents were calling their children, begging them to come home. As police began to comb the forest, they didn't just find one grave, they found a graveyard. 7 victims were eventually discovered, all of them young travelers who had been hitchhiking. The press called him the Backpack Killer, and the entire nation began to look at every passing driver with suspicion. Who was the man who turned a beautiful forest into a hunting ground? The killer wasn't a traveler himself, he was a local. Ivan Milat was a road worker who spent his days repairing the very highways his victims used. He was a man who knew the bush perfectly. He knew which trails lead nowhere and which areas were never patrolled. Milat's tactic was simple but effective. He would drive his 4WD vehicle along the highway looking for lone pairs of hitchhikers. He was friendly, offering a lift and a cool drink. But once he veered off the main road and into the Belonglo State Forest, the trap snapped shut. Milat didn't just kill for the sake of it, he was a sport killer. He would hunt his victims through the brush, using them for target practice. He was a man who felt powerful only when he was in total control of another human being's life. The police had no leads until a man named Paul Onions called from halfway across the world. Years earlier, while backpacking in Australia, Paul had been offered a ride by a man who called himself Bill. During the drive, Bill pulled a gun and a set of ropes. Paul didn't freeze. He jumped out of the moving car and ran across the highway, narrowly escaping into the arms of a passing motorist. At the time, the police hadn't connected Paul's story to anything serious, but now, with bodies piling up in the forest, they flew Paul back to Australia. He was shown a lineup of photos, and without a second of hesitation, he pointed to the face of Ivan Milat. The ghost of Belonglo finally had a name. When police raided the Milat family home, they found a literal museum of horror. Camping equipment, clothing, and cameras belonging to the victims were tucked away in the rafters as trophies. What makes the Milat case truly disturbing is the family dynamic. Ivan was one of 14 children, many of whom were obsessed with weapons and lived by a code of silence. Investigators realized that Ivan hadn't been acting in a vacuum. His brothers likely knew about his hobbies. Despite the overwhelming evidence, including the victim's property in his house, Ivan Milat never confessed. He maintained a smug, arrogant grin throughout his trial, even as he was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms. Ivan Milat died in prison in 2019, taking many secrets to his grave. Authorities believe he may have been responsible for many more disappearances across the Australian outback. He remains the face of Australia's loss of innocence, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous animal in the wilderness isn't the wildlife, but the man offering you a ride to your next destination.
Sacramento, California, 1977. While the world was focused on the Son of Sam in New York, a different kind of terror was brewing in the suburbs of California. Richard Chase was a man who lived in a state of constant, terrifying delusion. He was convinced that his blood was turning to powder and that his heart was shrinking. To save himself, he began to believe he needed to consume the life force of others. It started with small animals, but soon the neighborhood began to notice something was wrong with the man who lived in the apartment on Watt Avenue. He had been institutionalized before, and doctors had warned that he was a danger to himself and others, but due to a lack of space and a misunderstanding of his condition, he was released back into society. It was a mistake that would cost several lives. Chase's method of choosing victims was completely random. He didn't stalk people for weeks, and he didn't use complicated traps. Instead, he would simply walk down a street and try the front door handles of various houses. In his twisted mind, an unlocked door was an invitation. If the door was locked, he believed he wasn't welcome and would move on. But if the door opened, he saw it as a sign that he was supposed to enter. This test is one of the most chilling parts of the case. It meant that for the people of Sacramento, the only thing standing between them and a monster was a simple deadbolt. In January 1978, he found his first invitation at the home of Teresa Wallen, and the city's peace was shattered forever. The violence escalated with terrifying speed. Just days after his first attack, Chase entered the home of Evelyn Myroth. It was a scene of chaos that left 4 people dead, including a young child. The crime scenes were so disturbing that even veteran police officers had to step outside to compose themselves. The FBI's behavioral science unit was called in. They realized they weren't looking for a calculated genius like Edmund Kemper. They were looking for a disorganized killer. Someone who was living in filth, likely unemployed, and suffering from severe psychosis. They predicted the killer would live within walking distance of the crime scenes. They were right. The search narrowed down to a single apartment complex where neighbors had already complained about a man who looked like he hadn't slept or bathed in months. When police finally raided Richard Chase's apartment, they found the physical manifestation of his delusions. The walls and floors were stained, and his refrigerator was filled with evidence of his horrific diet. He was arrested while trying to flee with a box of evidence. In court, his defense argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, but the jury found that his ability to flee and hide evidence showed he understood his crimes were wrong. He was sentenced to death, but died in his cell in 1980. The case of Richard Chase changed how the FBI looked at mental illness and crime. It taught investigators that the most dangerous person isn't always the one with a plan. Sometimes it's the person who has completely lost touch with reality and acting on a logic that only they can understand.
Most serial killers are lone wolves, but in 1979, the California coast was haunted by a duo. Lawrence B.T.K and Roy Norris met behind the bars of a California prison. B.T.K was the mastermind, highly intelligent, cold, and dominant. Norris was the follower, a man with a dark history who was easily influenced by B.T.K's charisma. While in prison, they didn't talk about rehabilitation. They talked about the plan. They spent their time sketching out a design for a specialized van and making a list of the tools they would need. They weren't planning a robbery or a heist. They were planning a spree of violence that would target the teenagers of Los Angeles. When they were paroled, the world saw 2 men who had paid their debt to society. In reality, society was about to pay the price for their release. Once free, the pair purchased a silver GMC van and nicknamed it the Murder Mac. They outfitted the interior with soundproofing and a literal toolbox filled with household items, pliers, hammers, and screwdrivers. These weren't for repairs. They were the instruments of a living nightmare. Their strategy was to drive along the Pacific Coast Highway looking for teenage girls hitchhiking to the beach. B.T.K and Norris looked like 2 ordinary guys out for a drive. They were polite and offered rides to girls who were just trying to get home or to a party. But once the van door slid shut, the Silver Bird became a prison. Between June and October of 1979, 5 young women disappeared from the coast, leaving behind a trail of grief and a mystery that the LAPD struggled to solve. What set B.T.K and Norris apart from other killers was their desire to document the suffering of their victims. They didn't just commit crimes, they recorded them on a handheld cassette player. They wanted to be able to relive the power they felt in those moments long after the crimes were over. These tapes would eventually become the most infamous pieces of evidence in criminal history. Years later, when the FBI began training new agents at Quantico, they would play these tapes to show the reality of pure evil. Many agents couldn't finish the recording, leaving the room in tears. The tapes proved that B.T.K and Norris weren't just killing for a motive, they were killing because they enjoyed the absolute destruction of another human being's spirit. The spree ended not because of a brilliant police chase, but because of Roy Norris's conscience, or perhaps his fear. Norris began to brag about the crimes to a friend, who eventually went to the authorities. When the police closed in, Norris turned on B.T.K immediately, trading a confession for a life sentence. B.T.K, the leader of the duo, was sentenced to death. He spent decades on death row, showing zero remorse and even taunting the families of his victims. He died of natural causes in 2019, while Norris passed away in 2020. They are a haunting reminder that some bonds are born in darkness, and that the most dangerous weapon a predator can have is a partner who shares their worst instincts.
California, the mid-1970s. In the quiet neighborhoods of Visalia and later Sacramento, a shadow began to move through the backyards. At first, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, a strange intruder who would break into homes just to move things around, scatter jewelry, or look through personal belongings. People felt watched. They found their porch lights unscrewed and their gate latches left open. It was a psychological game. But soon, the game turned deadly. The prowler evolved. He became the East Area rapist, attacking women in their homes while their husbands were tied up nearby. He was a master of terror who used the plates on the back trick. He would stack dinner plates on a husband's back and tell him that if he heard the plates rattle or break, he would kill everyone in the house. For years, he was a ghost that the police couldn't touch. How did a man commit over 50 sexual assaults and at least 13 murders across California without ever being caught? The answer was chillingly simple. He was one of them. Joseph James D'Angelo was a police officer. While the state was on high alert, D'Angelo was wearing a badge. He used his professional training to evade detection. He knew how to avoid leaving fingerprints. He knew how police cordons worked, and he knew how to scout neighborhoods without looking suspicious. He was a shadow cop, using his knowledge of the law to break it. Even when he was eventually fired from the force for shoplifting, he simply moved to a new city and continued his spree, eventually becoming the original Night Stalker in Southern California. In 1986, the murders suddenly stopped. For 3 decades, the trail went cold. The Golden State Killer became a legend, a boogeyman that investigators obsessed over but could never identify. The DNA technology of the 90s and 2000s confirmed that the crimes in Northern and Southern California were committed by the same man, but his DNA wasn't in any criminal database. He had no prior felony record. The case sat in boxes until an investigator named Paul Holes and a writer named Michelle McNamara decided to try something radical. They didn't look for the killer's DNA in a police database. They looked for it in a public ancestry database, the kind people use to find their long-lost cousins. In 2018, the trap finally closed. By uploading the killer's old DNA to a genealogy site, investigators found a distant cousin. From that one relative, they built a massive family tree,
branch by branch until it led to a 72-year-old grandfather living in a quiet suburb of Sacramento, Joseph James D'Angelo. Police watched him for days. They eventually retrieved a piece of trash he had discarded, a tissue, and tested the DNA. It was 100% a match. When they arrested him in his driveway, the ghost was finally seen. He was a frail-looking old man, but the terror he had sowed for 40 years was fresh in the minds of his victims. His capture launched a new era of genetic genealogy, proving that you can hide from the police, but you can never hide from your own blood.